All right, well, good morning again, everybody. Here we are on another beautiful Sunday. I would like to thank Heidi for filling in for me last week. It was very helpful. I had a great time at my concert. It was freezing. I went down to Tucson for a little festival thing, and it was like camp out and everything. The first night, 20-mile-an-hour winds and a low of 33 degrees. I was not happy in my tent, I'll tell you that much. I had my little stove next to me. I'm warming up my hands, putting them back in the sleeping bag, warming up my hands. It was not fun, but the rest of it was. Then another bit of good news is I had an interview last week or this week, whatever, and I'm going to be the assistant manager for Domino's, so that's looking up. I've been really stressing about the job thing lately, so the one I have now is not enough hours, and I'm running out of savings. So that's good to be able to replenish that a bit. So today we're going to be talking about crises and how God can see us through them. I'll go ahead and start us off with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for allowing us all to gather before you today and be in your house and listen to some more of your words. Please help it to touch us and give us some insight on how to live our lives better in a more holy way. Help us to use the stories of all of the people that you've guided through their crises to help guide us through when we're having hard times. And help us not to forget that when we're having good times, that it's all because of you and it's all in your plan. I like to pray for everyone who's not here and help John get better and everyone else in the church who is not doing as well, and outside of the church too. And I like to ask all these things in your name. Amen. So today we're going to be in Genesis 41, verses 28 through 32 and 47 through 54. So it says in the life connection, as we have all been impacted by economic downturn. It could be as minor as paying more for food or gas, or as major as losing a job or a home. God is bigger than the economy or the world market. In the book of Genesis, we see how God prepared and led Joseph in the midst of the hard times that people were about to experience. While our situations are different from Joseph's, the Bible offers some principles in this story to help us stand strong in the midst of our own hard times. And the setting is Joseph found himself in Egypt because of his brothers had sold him to the Ishmaelite traders. In turn, they sold him to Potiphar, an Egyptian officer, and he served Potiphar well. But then Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of attempting to rape her. Consequently, Potiphar put him in prison. Then he interpreted the dreams of the Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and baker. And Joseph asked the cupbearer to talk with the Pharaoh about releasing him from prison so that he could return to his family. So I'm not exactly sure of the timeline of all this, but from my understanding, this whole period of being sold by his brothers up until now is somewhere around 2-ish years, at least a few years. So that's a lot of time to be having a lot of negative. I mean, he had some positives in there for sure, and they highlight those positives pretty well. But it's a hard thing to go through all that stress and all that hardship for as long as he did. And I know on occasion I go through some pretty long hardships too, but I don't think I've had it more than a year hardship for quite a while, so I'm blessed about that. It has a question that says, how did people deal with COVID-19 pandemic initially? Boy, was that fun to watch. That was a crazy time, and I'm just glad that I had been broke before, so I always have lots of extra stored up. I buy in bulk, and I try to make sure that when I start running low, I get more bulk. But I know a lot of people didn't have it as easy. A lot of people having to steal toilet paper from public places, or there was everyone bought up all the meat and canned goods and everything, and couldn't even find rice for a while. It was pretty bad, but we got through it, and now, even though it's still around, it's Nevada lifted their mask mandate last week or the week before, and we're starting to get back to some semblance of normal. So it says, life is full of ups and downs. A star quarterback throws a game-winning touchdown, and his name is plastered all over the media. The following week, however, a bone-crushing injury brings his career to a shocking end. The opposite can also happen. A teenage girl living in poverty creates a YouTube video of her favorite song, and it goes viral, traveling all over the world. Within days, she's offered multiple opportunities to sing. Her meteoric success inspires young musicians everywhere. Sudden reversals can happen to us all, creating a test of our faith and character. For many, the arrival of the pandemic in 2020 caused just such a sudden reversal. In today's study, we'll see Joseph travel from the prison to the palace in a single day. His many years of suffering are finally repaid with a huge personal reward. Pay attention to the way Joseph kept his eyes on God through the good times and the bad. While success can cause some to grow self-reliant and self-absorbed, Joseph modeled for us what it means to remain faithful no matter how high or low life takes us. So personally, when the pandemic first happened, I was happy. It's hard to get time off at a casino, and I was a card game dealer. And I remember when it was on the news and everything, I told everybody, I was like, we're gonna be out of work for a month or two at least. And I was like, don't say that. But it was traveling so fast, but I took advantage of it, and I kind of like to be by myself anyways, some friends, but not too big of groups. So I was going kayaking and hiking and camping and just about anything I could do that I wouldn't be in too much contact with other people. And I kept saying, the pandemic's great. I have no problems. I'm having a great time. And then in August, I went and had my accident, and that changed my life upside down. And I remember laying in bed in the hospital asking God, why did this happen? What am I going to learn from this? What am I going to be stronger with? What is the rest of my life even going to do? Because at that point in the hospital with a broken back and broken neck, I didn't know if I'd ever be able to be normal again. They told me that I'd get back to somewhat normal, but never what I was. But I think I'm more or less back there. Could gain another 20 pounds I lost in the hospital, but that'll come. So it says to call to the attention that God will see us through any crisis. And I know in my life and all the crises that I've had, it's very hard. I've said this, it's very hard to see in the moment what it's doing for us and how it's helping us and how it's bringing us closer to the Lord or making us stronger people. But looking back, I can just about see every crisis I had did something to strengthen me, strengthen my relationship with somebody, strengthen my relationship with God. And sometimes it's very hard to take a look back on all that hardship and see something like that, but it's there if you look hard enough. So Genesis 41 verses 28 through 32. It is just as I told the Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will take place, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it, for the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to the Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God and he will carry it out soon. So it says how much dreams actually go in, because I think it's called divination or something, of the study of your dreams and what they mean. And I thought that was more of a pagan thing. But apparently that, He's got to come to you in some way, whether it be a big blinding light, a burning bush, or in your dreams. So that was an interesting little tidbit for me. So the powerful Egyptian pharaoh awoke with a troubled soul, desperately looking for an interpretation for his own dreams. The last domino to fall related to the cupbearer's dream. Joseph had asked the cupbearer to remember him before the pharaoh when he was released from prison. The cupbearer did just that, but 2 years later. Now at the pharaoh's dreams, likely the main topic around the palace, the cupbearer remembered his error. It's all in God's timing. The pharaoh's dreams were visually vivid: healthy grain, thin grain, fat cows, skinny cows. Joseph knew that only God could provide the meaning for those dreams. For 7 years, Egypt would have abundance, but the following 7 years would bring a devastating famine. Joseph concluded the interpretation of the pharaoh's dream by saying, "The matter has been determined by God, and he will soon carry it out." Joseph unapologetically represented the one and only true God. Rather than giving himself credit and drawing attention to his own ability to interpret the dreams, he chose to give all the glory to God. Nothing took his eyes off the Lord. And with how much bad happened to him, that's a pretty strong thing there to not or just give it all to the Lord. And while we know today that a lot of that comes from the Lord, but in Egypt, I'm pretty sure that the Lord hadn't really spread out there that much yet, and so he could have had every chance to act as a prophet or something like that, and but he chose to keep the Lord's name there. When wisdom was needed, divine wisdom, Joseph was ready. He maintained a walk with God during the dark days. Therefore, when the time came, he was in a position to hear from God and display the wisdom needed in that moment. So in verse 28, it says, "This episode in Joseph's life teaches us believers to seek God's wisdom when we face hard times. Joseph interpreted the dream of the Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, knowing that the cupbearer would be restored. Joseph asked him to talk to the Pharaoh about Joseph's plight. However, the cupbearer forgot to say anything to the Pharaoh about Joseph. 2 years later, a troubling dream awoke the Pharaoh. After he fell asleep again, he had a similar dream. The dreams haunted the Pharaoh. He asked his magicians for help, but to no avail. Then the cupbearer remembered Joseph. He told the Pharaoh Joseph had interpreted his dreams 2 years earlier. In turn, Pharaoh had Joseph brought to him immediately. Once Joseph found himself in the presence of the Pharaoh, he assured Pharaoh God would be able to interpret the dreams. Then Joseph explained the dreams' meanings. Egypt would enjoy 7 years of agricultural prosperity, followed by 7 years of abysmal famine. Once more, Joseph pointed the Pharaoh directly to God, who had a plan. With the 2 dreams, God had given the Pharaoh the necessary insight into how the future would unfold, so he could lead Egypt successfully into the future. I need some more caffeine. So we may not get dreams telling us what's going on, and we may not have things laid out for us as easily as the Pharaoh had to see what's coming. But usually if we take a look back or take a look at people in our lives or stories of the Bible, we can kind of find a way to get through our hardships. It still is going to be hard. It's still going to be a lot of work, but there's some solace in knowing that, everything is for a reason and that we will be better afterwards. And that no hardship will last forever. In verses 29 and 30, Joseph reiterated that God would bless the land of Egypt with a harvest that would produce great abundance. The Nile River flowed through Egypt, and every year it flooded. When the flood receded, rich topsoil remained in its wake. The topsoil enriched the ground and made it superb for agriculture. According to Joseph's interpretation of the Pharaoh's dreams, the harvest for the next 7 years would be better than anyone could imagine. but Pharaoh could rest assured famine would come. In keeping the Pharaoh's dreams, the famine would afflict Egypt for the next 7 years. For a while, the nation would be able to press on because the memory of the 7 years of abundance would give them hope that the famine would not last very long. But the first year would give way to the second year, and with no change in the dismal agricultural forecast, every year of the famine that passed would leave the people of Egypt less hopeful about a prosperous harvest. Eventually, 7 productive years will be forgotten. People would lose hope altogether as they watched the land that once produced more than enough food for them become nothing but an empty, barren wasteland that provided nothing to eat. As they watched the deteriorations of their field, they would have nothing in their minds except for despair. So that's kind of almost like watching COVID unfold. It started off as, oh, this won't be that bad. And then everything was missing. And then just a ton of other things happened. But we all knew that it couldn't last for forever. And I don't think anyone assumed it would last as long as it did. But, we're starting to get out of our 1.5 2 years of not famine, but, there's a whole lot of other hardships and supply chain issues and all that other stuff. And it's also, I also like to point out that eventually the 7 productive years will be forgotten. It's really easy to forget the good times when we're in the middle of the hard times. And I like to try to look back personally on the good times and remember that they are coming again. It might not be the same good times. It might not be in the same place with the same people, but eventually we're going to have good times again. And that's what I try to tell myself a lot when I'm experiencing hardship. Verses 31 through 32. Once more, Joseph told the Pharaoh that the Egyptians would not remember the 7 years of plentiful harvest once the 7 years of famine took hold. By repeating his warning, Joseph underscored for the Pharaoh a grave truth about the effect of famine. Hungry people would have short memories. Eventually, they would forget about the plentiful harvest of the past years. Their thought would only focus on their need to find something to eat. 2 years earlier, Joseph had faded from the cupbearer's memory. Likewise, the days of plenty would dim from the people's memories as they faced very severe years of famine to follow. As a youth, Joseph had 2 similar dreams. The cupbearer and baker had dreams while they were in prison. Even though the 2 dreams bore distinct differences, they also shared key similarities. Now Pharaoh had 2 quite similar dreams. His dream had significance. Joseph warned the Pharaoh that having the same dream given twice verified with complete certainty that God would make the Pharaoh's dreams come true. Egypt would definitely experience 7 years of plentiful harvest, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. Pharaoh made a wise choice when he ordered Joseph to be brought from the prison. By having Joseph in his presence, he had access to the wisdom of God. Even though the Pharaoh might not have recognized it at first, Joseph's interpretation of the dreams ushered the Pharaohs into the presence of God. Joseph faithfully declared to the Pharaoh that the certainty of God's plan for Egypt. By listening to Joseph, the Pharaoh had been given the opportunity to get God's wisdom regarding the future predicted in his dreams. So during hard times, whether we're going through it or usually more so when other people are going through it, it's a great time to witness to people. It's a great time to come before them and maybe tell them about your own hardships or tell them about some hardships from the Bible and let them know that, everything's within God's plan and he will bring abundance back to their life, that he will be there for them in the darkest of dark times and the hardest times. And he will also be there for them when everything gets better and they have a lot less to worry about. Would you like to read Genesis 41, Heidi?
Yes. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvests. Joseph gathered all the excess food in the land of Egypt during the 7 years and put it in the cities. He put the food in every city from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure.
So there's a few instances in the Bible where they bring up such abundance that they put it in a way that's hard to count. When the Lord, what's his name? It'll say it in here somewhere, but I think it's Abraham. The Lord told Abraham that he would have kids that would number as many as the stars, or descendants that would number as many as the stars. And then this one, like the sand of the sea, which I don't think anyone's going to go out there and count sand molecules. It's just beyond measure the amount of good things that God can put into our life. Sometimes it can be hard to, bless you. Sometimes it can be hard to realize the abundance that we have in our life, but when you sit and you take inventory of it all, whether it's kids or family members or just spending some more time with somebody than you normally get to, there is tons of abundance in our lives, and it just takes a little bit of looking to see it. So it says, emphasize that when we seek God's wisdom in a crisis, we can count on him to give us his direction. Studying Joseph's faithfulness to follow God's plan helps us to take the same faithful steps. Joseph never lost sight of God's plan. Okay. Without missing a beat, Joseph offered an unsolicited but brilliant business plan to get them through the rough years ahead. Pharaoh recognized Joseph's unique talent behind his plan, so he promoted Joseph to second in command. The pressure was on for Joseph. He had recommended to the Pharaoh, was now his to own and execute, and he went to work immediately. For the first 7 years, the rains came down and the crops came up. Just as the Lord said, the economy was booming, the people celebrated the riches produced by the land, and Joseph took in all the wealth of the land, but he never allowed it the power to hypnotize him. He kept his eyes on the Lord and remembered what God had told him. The prosperity was a blessing, but he knew that the tide would roll out just as it had rolled in. So Joseph's a pretty stand-up guy. He had had multiple chances to take advantage of the positions that he was in, and he never let it get to him. A lot of people are blinded by power and money and everything else, and it could have been extremely easy for him. I don't know if it brings up too many times where people may have tried to influence him to make the wrong decisions, or influence him to, maybe buy some of that extra grain off of him without telling anybody or something like that. But it had to come up with 7 years of him going through and collecting all this grain and being pretty much the head guy. It says later in here that he was only second to the Pharaoh in his power. So that's a really good role model for us to try to emulate. That no matter how hard it gets and no matter how great it gets, he's still following the Lord and doing the right thing. So it has a question on page 106, and it says, when is it most challenging for you to follow God's plan? I think the easy answer might be when everything's going wrong around us. But if any of you want to give another example, otherwise I'll just continue on.
In the military.
Yeah, I assume that's pretty dang challenging in itself. I never went, but from everything I see and all the family members I had in it, there's a lot to unpack there. And just from my understanding, living in the dorms with all these other people, and then a lot of the times on their weekends or days off or leave, they'll go to strip clubs and go do all this other things that are very ungodly, and a lot of them drink like a fish, which is not good. So yeah, I bet the military is a very hard place to follow God's plan. So in verse 47, says that when we seek God's wisdom in a crisis, we can count on him to give us his direction. Studying Joseph's faithfulness to follow God's plan helps us to take the same faithful steps. Once Joseph interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams, he recommended a plan of action. He advised the Pharaoh to take advantage of the 7 years of good harvests by storing enough grain for the 7 years of famine. After Joseph offered his advice, the Pharaoh responded by appointing Joseph to a position of authority over Egypt that would guarantee the success of this plan. Only the Pharaoh himself would have more authority over Egypt than Joseph. Joseph's advice included the appointment of overseers who would be in charge of collecting excess grain during the plentiful years. He also recommended a royal decree calling for 1/5 of each year's produce to be stored away. As the productive years unfolded, Joseph found himself quite busy because the land had produced outstanding harvests. The Hebrew rendered outstanding harvest painted a picture of someone holding up fistfuls or handfuls of grain. In keeping with his plan, God provided much more grain for Egypt than the nation could consume. Verse 48, the process of collecting food could have turned into something of a crisis in itself if God had not given Joseph the plan needed to complete the collection process. Joseph never lost sight of God's plan as he moved through the mountain of details associated with his work. He followed it every step of the way until he completed the task of preparing Egypt for the 7 years of famine. The challenge before him can only be described as colossal. In keeping to the Pharaoh's decree, Joseph had collected 1/5 of the grain harvested in each of the 7 years of plentiful produce. Collecting the food required him to establish and supervise an organization composed of workers who had a wide array of work skills. They would need to know how to construct buildings, collect and transport the harvest, and account for as well as protect what had been gathered. These workers would need to be supervised by administrators who would work under Joseph's leadership. As he carried out the plan that God had given, furthermore, Joseph would need to manage the project closely for the span of 7 long years. Joseph's steadfast resolve to trust the Lord and follow him completely had been cultivated over the past 13 years of his life. Now it produced a sense of determination to follow God's plan regardless of the difficulty. Joseph constructed storage buildings in every city throughout Egypt, located near the fields for which the food would be gathered. He chose the cities based on their proximity to the fields. He must have managed a small army of workers who collected from each farmer all the excess food. He also developed and managed procedures for getting the food to the storage buildings and accounting for it properly. So there's a few things to unpack there. This must have been a very colossal undertaking, as it said. Back then, before the years of computers and all the easy accounting that we have now, to deal with all of his workers spread out across the entire country, to deal with the issues that would arise from some workers, dipping their fingers in the pot, so to speak, and to just manage that many people had to have been extremely stressful, if nothing else. I'd also like to point out that even though times were so good right now, you don't want to forget the rough times when things are good. You want to prepare yourself as much as you can for when things get hard again, because we go through a cycle of ebbs and flows. And it won't be good all the time, and it won't be bad all the time. But if we can set ourselves up to have it be a little less bad when the bad times come, then you'll be thanking yourself later. So for verse 49, Joseph encountered the problem he had apparently not anticipated. The fields yielded much more grain than he could measure. Accounting for the yield each year would provide Joseph with the necessary information for distributing it wisely in the lean years to come. The abundant harvest proved to be too much for his accounting system, so he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. He shifted attention exclusively to the challenge of storing it all properly. The description of 7 bumper crops in the plentiful years bore a striking similarity to how the Lord had described the fulfillment of his promise to Abraham. Joseph's great-grandfather. Not long after Abraham moved to Canaan, the Lord promised him that his family would grow to become a great nation. Abraham would have as many descendants as the innumerable stars in the sky. Later, the Lord repeated his promise to Abraham by the sand of the seashore. Counting grains of the sand of the seashore would be just as impossible as counting the number of Abraham's descendants. Comparing the gathering grain to the sand of the sea now depicted the immeasurable amount of grain gathered for the future. I imagine storing it for that long had to have been like probably one of the hardest things. Egypt is a fairly arid place, so I don't think that they had to deal with too much rain and stuff like that like we do. But keeping all the rats, keeping the pillagers, keeping just the grain good for that long. If it's 14 years from the start, that had to have been a colossal undertaking in itself. All right, we got Genesis 41, 50 through 54. Anyone else like to take a chance to read? All right, I'll go at it then. 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of the famine had arrived. Asenath and the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh and said, God has made me forget all my hardships and my whole family. Did I read that right? God has made me forget all my hardships and my whole family. The second son he named Ephraim and said, God has made me more fruitful in the land of my affliction. Then the 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end. The 7 years of famine began, and just as Joseph has said, there was famine in every land, but in the whole land of Egypt there was still food. So, summarizing, while the Egyptian economy was thriving, Joseph experienced other blessings as well. The Lord gave him the gift of family. In the first 7 years as the prime minister, Joseph fathered 2 sons, and their names had significant meaning to Joseph. Manasseh means he who causes to forget. His birth helped Joseph put the past behind him. Baby Manasseh would help Joseph to realize that he had his own family to build and release any remaining toxic emotions caused by his siblings. I'm sure that had to have been hard because, like I said, years and years had passed since that, and it wasn't the greatest life. And then Ephraim means fertile, and this describes the seasons of life Joseph was enjoying. Not only was his family growing, but his influence and leadership were soaring as well. The names Manasseh and Ephraim were also special because they were Hebrew names. Surrounded by Egyptian culture and gods, Joseph didn't waver from his faith to the Lord. He was heading into 7 years of struggle, but he kept his faith strong and ready for what God was doing. And I'm sure as the prime minister of Egypt, I'm sure that he had all sorts of influence to walk away from God and go to their cats and Anubis and whatever else they had praised. But he didn't let any of his hard times in the pit, he didn't let his hard times in jail, he didn't let nothing come between him and the Lord. So God strengthened Joseph with gifts, skill, and stamina so he could complete the task at hand. But God also blessed him with a family. God had led Joseph from enduring unspeakable afflictions to experiencing indescribable fulfillment that came with the success of leading Egypt and rearing his 2 sons. Verse 50, it says, fruitful years eventually gave way to lean years. The transition could create a terrible crisis. Joseph showed us how to be fruitful even in the face of the most difficult times. Joseph collected as much food as possible before the years of the famine had arrived. God strengthened him with gifts, skills, and stamina so he could complete the task at hand, but God also did something else in Joseph's life. He blessed Joseph with a family that included 2 sons. When Joseph began his work of collecting food, he was 30 years old. The previous 13 of his life had been spent in Egypt, first a slave, then as a prisoner. During the 7 years of the plentiful harvest, Asenath became his wife, and her father, Potipharah, was an Egyptian priest who led the worship of Re, the god of, I think that's Ra actually, the god of the sun. On, also known as Heliopolis, was the location of the temple devoted to the worship of Ra. When Joseph's words and actions in the years that followed, he demonstrated that he did not compromise his walk with the Lord. He never worshipped Ra or any other idol, even though his father-in-law served as a priest of the Egyptian deity. I'm sure that had to make family dinners very fun. Verse 51. God blessed Joseph and Asenath with their first son. Joseph named his newborn Manasseh, and the name sounded like the Hebrew word to forget. Fitting for the particular time in Joseph's life, in order for Joseph to move ahead in the work that God had given him, he needed to put his past behind him. And I think that's something that we could all do in order to really be abundant in our lives and to deal with all the great things that we get and to not look at things with a jaded view or with some toxicity. That we need to put the past behind us. It's very hard. It's a lot easier to say that than to do it, but I like to use the expression that the past is the past and all we can do is learn from it. Can't go back, can't change anything. We can't really do much to change the things that happen except for learn from it and walk better in the future. When he reflected on the previous years in Egypt, he could recount little more than a life of extreme hardship. Slavery and prison served as bookends of the story that had been filled with heartache. But Joseph could trace his agony all the way back to his home in Canaan. There his brothers resented him because his father had favored him, then betrayed him. Thankfully, God healed him so that he would no longer be consumed by the misery of his past. Although he did not forget the events or the people involved in them, his recollection of the pain faded. Manasseh reminded him of how God had enabled him to let go of the past. Verse 52. Joseph's second son he named Ephraim. The name sounded like the Hebrew word for fruitful. When Ephraim came to the constant reminder that Joseph could take hold of the present as well as the future now that he has been released from the pain of the past, he could recognize his life as productive. God performed a miracle in Joseph's life. In the land far from Canaan, God had led Joseph from enduring unspeakable affliction to experiencing indescribable fulfillment that came with the success in leading Egypt and rearing his two sons. Every step of the way, God prepared Joseph so that he could be fruitful in his work. So I'm sure that we could look back on our lives and see a lot of good, fruitful things that came that helped us deal with some of the pains of the past. Some of it could be having a child and raising them better than you were raised, letting go of some of the hardships of things that happened in your life and not letting that affect your child. Or for others of us, it could be dealing with pain of maybe being bullied in school or maybe some abuse and just not letting that transfer over to other people in your life, not letting that turn you cold and jaded and to keep the cycle continuing. We need to break those cycles so that way future generations don't have to deal with it like we did. Verses 53 and 54, the door of opportunity for Joseph to be fruitful did not close once the 7 years of plentiful harvest had ended. He could also look ahead to the fruitfulness of the future as he guided Egypt through 7 difficult years of famine. In keeping with Joseph's interpretation of the Pharaoh's dream, a terrible famine followed on the heels of the productive years. In due time, the famine ravaged Egypt, But it didn't stop there. To make the crisis even more critical, the famine turned out to be extensive and led to food shortages everywhere. Soon the people in every land began to search for something to eat because they didn't have adequate resources stored away. Thanks to Joseph's leadership, in Egypt alone there was food. The years of excellent harvest, Joseph followed God's plan so the Egyptians as well as the surrounding peoples would be able to endure the famine that would grip them for the next 7 years. The famine brought an international crisis that gave Joseph the opportunity to be productive once again. He took responsibility for distributing the grain that had been gathered and stored in the Egyptian cities. The Pharaoh gave Joseph complete authority over the food distribution process. The hungry people from everywhere came to him for grain. So again, that is a lot of trust to be placed on Joseph. After having all of that negative things happen to him, after being a slave, after being accused of rape, after being imprisoned, he still was able to come out of it and still be a good person, not let all these things affect him. And that's something that we could take into our life, is even though we experience a lot of hardships and a lot of bad times, we don't have to let it get to us. We don't have to let it determine our future. It's up to us to do well and to continue to try to live a life that isn't underscored by those painful times. So it says, sudden turns in work or the family can create stress, uncertainty, and fear. Joseph seemed to keep his cool no matter what life threw at him, and this is a sign of true spiritual maturity. Consider these 3 ways to take the lesson from Joseph's life. Stay focused on God. Ask God to help you identify your famine. What areas in your life currently feel bleak and dry? Give it to God. Then make a list of all the beautiful things happening in your life right now. Tape that list to your bathroom mirror or somewhere that you can begin every day with praise. Give what you can. Be on the lookout for opportunities to meet the need of your family, friends, the church, the neighborhood, or the community. If you are in a time of abundance, time, money, or so on, make sure that your generosity reflects this. If you're in a time of famine, trust God and give what you can. Glorify God. When we're experiencing success, seek out opportunities to tell others about God's work in your life. When you experience failure, seek out opportunities to share with others that you trust in God to see you through. And to wrap it up, Joseph kept his eyes on God throughout the good times and the bad. He modeled for us what it means to remain faithful, no matter how high or low life takes us. While our situations are different from Joseph, the Bible offers some principles in this story to help us stand strong in the midst of our own hard times. So yeah, that's definitely an extremely hard life that he had. And if he can continue to do the right thing, then, so can we. So before I wrap us up, does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns, statements?
What I like to tell people is their mistakes or their past don't define who they are. Because you can always learn, be a better person. Right. That's exactly right. And a lot of the people who end up coming to church come from some hardship. Maybe they just maybe they found God in prison. Maybe they were just at complete rock bottom and decided they needed to change their life, and God brought them to us or to a different church. And so no one is too far gone. No matter how hard life gets, no matter if we fall off the walk and we go down a bad path, we can always still come back. We can always still choose to live our lives in a good, godly way and to give to others. So I will wrap us up with a prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for being with us in the good times and the bad. Thank you for bringing us through our own famines in life, whether it be with
spiritually or friends or money or family or anything like that, you're still there to give us your guiding hand. And don't let us forget that when times are great and we have all this abundance, that it is because of you. And there is other people who were just in our shoes of having a bad time. Allow us to see the moments where we can help others, help ourselves, and just help all those around us to not experience these plights for as long, or at least give them a little bit of light in their dark times. I ask that you help us look for ways this week that we can witness to other people about the glory of God, whether they're having great times in their abundance or whether they're in their dark famine. I ask that you be with us as we go into the other room and listen to the pastor's message, and that his message can touch us too and give us something to think about and work on this week. I thank you for everything you do in our lives, Lord, and in Jesus' name, amen.
So you served in the